Well, thank you so much for inviting me to your conference. It's really a privilege to deliver the Furedy lecture, and I also look forward to speaking tomorrow. Now, my topic tonight is our American education system, relevant, I hope, also to yours. What is wrong with it? How it should be reformed? This is not a small topic, and of course, it's an evergreen. Everyone is always talking about reforming education. But I'm going to give you my own personal view of the matter from what today would be considered both a radical and a reactionary point of view. And I consider the term reactionary an honorific, okay? Because the past has a lot to teach us. And I'm going to focus on K through 12 education because I have learned through hard experience that that is where the trouble starts. But I am happy to address some issues in higher education during the Q&A. Now, I start from the unsurprising position that K through 12 education as a whole is desperately in need of overhaul, both in the nature and extent of its mission and what is actually taught. Why? Well, from top to bottom throughout our great nation, and both in public and much of private education, we have a system in the grip of a far-left, identity-obsessed social justice ideology. And this is fed by progressive schools of education, which are our native credentialing monopoly, and also by a cartel of accrediting organizations, another nefarious monopoly. The social justice ideology prioritizes indoctrinating young people into partisan activist beliefs and projects instead of preparing them to be effective and thoughtful citizens and workers. The partisan belief system that operates is what has come to be called wokeness, a left-wing ideology I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with, that divides people into oppressor and oppressed, blames Western societies for a host of ills, sees every inequality and disadvantage as the product of bigotry, and is obsessively focused on self-fashioning and defying biology, especially in the areas of sex and gender. What is even worse, this point of view, which insinuates itself into every subject, is presented as incontestable and virtuous, with traditional ideas, institutions, and practices tarred as evil and backward, and even more insidiously disrespectful, intolerant, uncivil, and uninclusive. And this, of course, reflects the background progressive dogma. Respect is redefined as, you must agree with me. Dissent becomes an affront, an insult. So what is to be done? Let's start at the bottom and make an important distinction. In my view, reforming K through 12, that project differs markedly from the steps that can and should be taken for higher ed. And I draw a very sharp line here, informed by both American politics and Americans' distinct legal landscape, which still places important limits on what the government can do in the areas of speech and thought when it comes to adults. For elementary through high school, however, we are not dealing with adults. So a few basic principles should apply. Children and adolescents are not ready to exercise their autonomy or choices as to what to learn and think. So schools must concentrate on preparing children for adult roles and responsibilities, not treating them as little adults. This means focusing narrowly on the tools and knowledge necessary to function as participants in our democracy and economy. Second, and this is controversial, the goals of K through 12 should be conservative. What do I mean by that? To transmit the knowledge and the wisdom of past generations and to preserve, protect, and defend our existing society. the Western advanced society we have achieved through great effort, one that is remarkably free, prosperous, liberal, and democratic, very tolerant, although hopefully not infinitely so, and therefore to foster an appreciation and reverence for our way of life and its many strengths. Does that sound unorthodox today? It is. Third, because there is scarcity, which many progressives deny, scarcity of time, resources, and attention, priorities must be established for designing a curriculum that includes some things but leaves many things out. In making these curricular judgments, schools should stop broadening their brief and start narrowing it far more than is currently fashionable, and at all times ceding a primary role to parents and private authorities in shaping and addressing minor children's moral values and even their political opinions. This is especially important in our pluralistic society where people differ sharply on contentious matters. So in deciding what should be taught, how it should be taught, and what should not be taught, the best policy is for schools to stay away from moralized aspects of private conduct or even fundamental political beliefs by simply avoiding these topics as much as possible, which pretty much means avoiding them entirely. And that means steering clear of hot-button issues, contested culture war questions, identity, gender, sex, race, immigration, political commitments, certainly in any kind of partisan, non-factual way. Now, are these precepts followed presently? Some people have said to me, oh, now that Trump is in charge, serious reform is going to happen, not to worry, wokeness is on the run. Not so fast. The left-leaning ideology still lives. It has not released its grip. It has established itself everywhere. Consider a recent Wall Street Journal article from May 23rd entitled, "Woke Education is Going Strong, Even in Middle America." The article describes how schools in Wauwatosa, I can't even pronounce it, Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, a white-bread middle American town, politically divided, has embraced far-left fads, including gender identity instruction, even in preschool, disastrous restorative justice programs for student misconduct that substitute play and games for punishment and detention, the elimination of ability tracking and special STEM gifted programs in the name of equity, and banishing phonics instruction, even though it works. Now, how did all this happen? Well, people were going about their business and ceded authority to experts from the education establishment and left-wing zealots who get themselves elected to school boards, which have power over these curricula. As the article notes, these features are countrywide, in communities red and blue, and firmly rooted. The article states they're like tumors that are not easily excised. Before addressing the difficult question of whether and how they can be excised, I want to get a little more specific about the system I envision to replace the one that exists. What would this ideal system look like in practice? For this, I put on my reactionary hat and I look to the past. First, let's talk about sex. That's a hot topic these days and controversial. Recently, our Supreme Court heard argument in a case called Mammoth v. Taylor. The issue was whether parents in Montgomery County, Maryland, had a legal right, based specifically on the constitutional religious objections, First Amendment objections, to opt out their very young children starting at the age of 4, from classroom language arts instruction using books about sex and sexuality and specific LGBTQ topics like gay pride. And here we are talking about books for preschoolers like Puppy Pride, My Uncle Just Got Married to a Man, and gender fluidity books that feature drag queens in leather and girls becoming boys, vice versa, and pronoun choices. The county school board had initially allowed an opt-out, but then abruptly reversed itself, pleading administrative burden, which the record revealed amounted to most of the parents, both religious and non-religious, wanted to opt their children out. That was called administrative burden. Now, there's a lot that can be said about this case, and I will say a little more later, but what is striking in the record is how highly sexualized materials, clearly representing an agenda, a distinct point of view, have made their way into elementary school curricula in so many places. And that was documented in the Supreme Court materials. To me, this is jarring. I grew up in a conservative town in upstate New York and went to school in the 50s and the 60s. I went to public school. And there was no sex education. None. Zero. It was totally absent. And look how well I turned out. I recently had a conversation with a contemporary, my husband's college roommate, who grew up on Long Island. I asked him, was sex even mentioned in your school? He said, of course not. If you brought it up, they said, ask your parents. No one challenged this state of affairs. No one had to be instructed to maintain a decorous silence. Why? Because everybody understood that there was no neutral, value-free way to approach these topics. They were inherently moralized, as they are in every civilized society that ever has existed. Sex is serious. It implicates right and wrong conduct. It implicates how you treat other people. Duh. When I tell my students that, they've never heard it before. They just look at me like, wow, that's amazing. Paradoxically, there was perfect consensus that these matters belong to parents, churches, private actors, and authorities, and certainly not to the government, through schools or otherwise. And that parents were entitled and indeed duty-bound to shape and mold their children by trying to pass on their values and views on these fundamentals without interference and meddling. They might not succeed in doing it, but they ought to be allowed to try. And schools had no right to attempt to override or interfere with this. And the method was to maintain a decorous silence. Today, the former consensus on many topics, including this one, no longer exists. But I think that only strengthens the argument for standing down, for a policy of avoidance and strenuous neutrality, at least to the extent that that is achievable. That means no sex education in K through 12 at all, except perhaps minimal facts of anatomy and function as part of a basic biology course. Nothing on gender fluidity, queerness, sexual practices, homosexuality, etc. Why should these even be part of the curriculum? And of course it means no gay pride month, endorsement, celebrations. In keeping with this, I think it is simply a conceptual confusion to label banishing explicit subjects and materials from classrooms and school libraries as a form of censorship or book banning. You hear this all the time. I just heard it from my cousin, right? A nice liberal lady who said, I don't want Governor DeSantis censoring my school libraries. That's just inept. It's a misnomer. It's a propagandistic term that is egregiously misleading and does not accurately describe reality. School officials can and must decide what materials are presented to minors at each stage in light of parental prerogatives and judgments about what is age appropriate. Right? And under our laws, and no one really seriously contests this, state and local authorities have full authority to decide what is said and presented, including in school libraries. Teachers and other personnel in K through 12 have no First Amendment or other rights to deviate from the script they are given by those who run the schools, despite popular insistence to the contrary. Now, why is this not censorship? Because individual parents remain free to instruct their children on whatever they want. Queer theory, gender fluidity, sexual positions, how to put on a condom, or anything else. Materials on this are broadly available in public libraries, from booksellers, and of course, on the internet. This stuff is all over the place. What progressive parents are not entitled to do is to have schools teach other people's children about this stuff. Right? And that is part and parcel of respecting that other parents might have very different views on what their children and even their teenagers should see and hear. It's really that simple. But of course, today it's not regarded as simple at all. Because whether and how sex is taught to our children in public schools and private is politicized. It's a matter of beliefs, ideology, hearts and minds, who has the power. As the Mammoth case reveals, at least to me, perusing its materials, what happens in this area and the question of parental versus government authority is not really primarily a matter of law, because the law on this general question of parental rights and the balance between parental authority and school authority for non-religious objections is actually both vague and weak. Right? So we can't really look to the law to resolve this. Unfortunately, the arguments for banishing sex from our schools has not been carefully explicated in terms that are persuasive to ordinary people or others. Many of them have intuitions, they have immediate reactions, but they're not very good at arguing their case. So why is instructing first graders on gender fluidity not age appropriate? What does that buzz phrase mean? When you ask people that, very few can answer the question. So maybe we can give it a try. Perhaps it's because very young children don't experience and can't understand sexual feelings and acts. And more importantly, they have little clue about the consequences of people's choices and conduct and the ramification of social norms and rules. These are subjects and questions that are just beyond their ken, right? And why can't we openly acknowledge that sex and sexual behavior has always been moralized, that it is never neutral, and that rules and restrictions are necessary because sex is fertile ground for exploitation of the weak by the strong, and that orderly families are the predicate of all culture and social life? How many people are capable of or willing to say these things to their neighbors? Enough on sex for now. This leads me to my second point. We should strive to achieve far more balance and depth in preparing children for citizenship, and that includes teaching them about our Constitution, our institutions, our economic system, and our history. What would that look like? Well, I actually take the position that every child should have a mandatory course in British history, but of course that is not a popular position. But at least the key word here is balance. post-Enlightenment societies have spawned and contributed to the success and durability of our system and are not uniquely evil. Racism and slavery, these have been common and widespread worldwide through cultures over time. Indian tribes and African tribes have not been very nice to one another. Violence, war, appropriation, and decimation of the enemy is the way of the world and a staple of human experience. We're not endorsing it, we're just recognizing reality. And without ignoring our American history of slavery and discrimination, the school should de-emphasize racial identity issues and grievances while conveying in more detail and with more pride the facts of our Western accomplishments and achievements. And when we do that in the schools, and it's not done, right, that is called white supremacy. Young people today are simply not exposed to the extent of Western and European and Anglo-American contributions. And they aren't encouraged to admire and venerate their own culture and country. And especially its capacity for progress, for self-criticism, for self-improvement, and self-correction. Every child should know that Western European societies were the first to abolish slavery. They were the first to democratize, to articulate and respect human rights, and to grow inconceivably wealthy through innovation and free exchange. And finally, there should be far less emphasis on current affairs and controversies, and much more not just on basic skills, but on cultural preservation and transmission. And I think there is far too little emphasis on that today. That means K through 12 is not a debating society. Despite widespread assumptions to the contrary, young children and even high school students really are not equipped to take on complex issues, which are challenging for most adults, and they're even challenging for my elite law students, as I know from experience. Children and adolescents should be prepared to take on these complex issues and controversies, but they shouldn't spend a lot of time doing it. And what does that mean? It means we will free up time and attention for all sorts of humble and useful subjects and skills that have been lost in the shuffle. Home economics, home repairs, basic finance, which ought to be part of the instruction that all children receive. And recently it has been suggested, and even proposed in some of our state legislatures, that informing all K through 12 students of the so-called success sequence should be mandatory. What is the success sequence? Some economists at the American Enterprise Institute have figured out that if young people follow 3 simple rules, their chance of being in poverty is in the single digits. They are finish high school, take any job and keep working at it, and get married before you have children. Sounds pretty simple. And I would add to that, obey the law. Don't commit crimes, which will lower your chances of poverty even more. Now you could say that's pushing values on children, right? Endorsing marriage. No, the success sequence is grounded in simple facts. Quantitative data, simple to teach and to understand. Now, how can these reforms take place? Not an easy task. As I indicated, the solutions are basically political. They are also, unfortunately, in our system anyway, largely local and decentralized. Our federal government actually has limited control over public schools and school districts, and detailed centralized national mandates, such as the Common Core or No Child Left Behind, have not worked out very well. Now, the Department of Education can try to effect some changes through its funding power, but that potential is limited. K through 12 system in America is mainly the purview of states and localities, so whatever happens has to happen there. That means reforms must happen state by state and school district by school district, which is a pain in the neck. As Oscar Wilde put it about democracy, it takes too many evenings. But as governors such as Ron DeSantis in Florida have shown, there is tremendous underutilized potential at the state level, coming from state departments of education. For example, here's one suggestion that is potentially transformative if you have the guts to implement it. States should stop accepting degrees from education schools as qualification for teaching. Indeed, they should become disqualified. Rather, they should require teachers. That's easy. It's really easy. Just pass a law, you know. If you have an education degree, you cannot teach. Rather, they should require teachers to have four-year college degrees in a substantive subject, and then, wait for it, to pass a statewide test. Now, the goal is to put education schools out of business. But here's the problem, because education schools have been contaminating our education system for decades, all right, because of the ideology that they're pushing. Now, unfortunately, resistance to testing is the American way, as tests of skills and knowledge inevitably have a disparate impact. They have a disparate impact by race. But my view is that that resistance should be fought or ignored because schools exist not for teachers but for students, and students need qualified and knowledgeable teachers. And the era of sacrificing merit for so-called equity, right, equal outcomes, really needs to come to an end, right? The current administration, the Trump administration, to its credit, is making strenuous efforts in this direction with a lot of blowback, of course. Just to summarize, and I'm sort of going to wind this up here, K through 12 schooling is of vital importance and ought to be a national priority. And for too long, conservatives and Republicans have ignored it. They have minimized it. Right? They should take that and put it at the top of their agenda. And it is starting to happen because it all starts in kindergarten. It really does. And I can tell you that as someone who teaches 20-somethings who have come through the best schools, the most elite, exclusive and selective schools, and they are getting a very partial and lopsided view of reality. Further, when young people ask my advice, I say to them, get married, have children, join your school board, work for your state education department, become advocates for a reactionary return to older standards, to tried and true ways of doing things. These old ways of doing things, they are there, they are waiting for you. Be a radical reactionary and a moral entrepreneur, and familiarize yourself with the strongest arguments for traditional practices, and be ready to try to convince others that they are superior. The past has much to teach us. Today, our American school system is failing to produce capable, loyal, and constructive citizens. We need to do better, and reactionary, radical reform will help us get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy, for that wonderful talk. Now, I'm sure there are many questions for Amy, so please approach the microphone if you have some. If not, I can start the question. Yeah, sure. You have one? Go ahead.
Hi, Amy. I don't know if you've met me, but policy. And I'm wondering what you think of this, that in the same way that, both in Canada and in the United States, that even though we have, provinces and states, that sometimes there'll be like a model federal code of laws that then states will adopt. And we have the same kind of unified codes in Canada that often follow Ontario. And I'm wondering what you would think of like a role, particularly now with the Republican government, to come out with a code that has like a core knowledge curriculum, that working backwards from grade 12. I agree with you, narrowed domain subject matter. And the fact is, in terms of instruction, there is, like there's traditional wisdom, but actually cognitive science has shown that there's a science behind that traditional wisdom that is proved true. We figured out better ways of doing it, but it's basically, you have an expert in a room who's instructing novices and making them practice, and you have to practice and put an effort in order to master things. That would be the traditional way. So what are your thoughts about, lobbying now that there is a Republican government, and we don't have that option here in Canada, but to say, let's put out a model code. Like there are countries that do this. Japan has a curriculum that it's like 30 pages for each grade. It tells the teacher, in September you do this, in October you do this, here's the books you're using. It's narrowed down, it's focused on things that develop a responsible citizen, and to be instructed in a way so that we make sure we're producing teachers to do this.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a ideal and theoretical matter, that's the best model to get some kind of prescribed curriculum that comports with the values that I think, and the content that I think everybody should learn. And in Europe, I know they do that. I mean, I think that model works in some places. Maybe it would work in Canada. I don't know enough about education in Canada.
We are so captured by what you were talking about. If you think it's bad in the States, just picture it 100 times worse.
There's really two issues. I mean, one is, how will people react to a centralized prescriptive curriculum? And in the United States, for reasons, I think are just kind of reactive and traditional, localities don't like being told by the federal government what they're going to teach. That was the idea behind the Common Core, and everybody had a million objections to it. I mean, in part, just everybody became a localist, even the left-wingers, right? Because they didn't like what was in the Common Core. So I think we're so wedded to our, localized, decentralized, federalized school system in the United States that it's just going to require like a major brain transplant before we're willing to accept that. But the other problem is that the whole educational establishment is captured by, I hate the word fringe because everybody uses that about me, but by a fringe, by an extremists, frankly, extreme far leftists. And they are ideological and adamant. I mean, you have to read the briefs and the transcript in the Supreme Court case, Moffitt v. Taylor, to just believe it. Believe that Montgomery County is bound and determined to expose 4-year-olds to puppy pride. I mean, absolutely. This is essential to the future of the Republic. There are people who believe that, and they control the school boards. So I don't know what to do about that, except to, mobilize and fight in the trenches of people who are not used to being activists. Conservative, mainstream, and right-leaning parents, they don't spend their time doing this. They spend their time working, raising their family, going to church, or whatever. So this is, a priority. They have to become more activist. That's why I admire Ron DeSantis, because, although every move he made has maybe not been optimal, at least he's moving. At least he sees the problem as a problem. And that's really important.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your talk, Amy. My name is Francis Whittleson. I'm a board member for the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. I've thought a lot about these issues myself in terms of the failure, and I have two questions. The first one is I've heard about this teacher education, teaching degrees having been noticed to be a serious problem for decades. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on why it seems to be so terrible with the instruction of teachers in the teaching educational areas. I think I saw a program by Lyle Asher who was talking about this being recognized for quite some time. The second question is about critical thinking and developing critical thinking skills. Do you see a role for that taking place in the educational system?
Right.
And how do you see that occur?
Yeah, well, the first of why education schools, have gone so off the rails, I think it's this unholy brew of the intrusion of, the therapeutic mindset, which has captured a lot of our society, but in particular, education. Education is about promoting feelings and attitudes and shoring up self-esteem and all of that, rather than actually teaching content and skills. Well, why has that attitude come into play? I don't have a completely developed theory. I'm just really describing the problem more than anything else. The other is this strange desire to professionalize teaching and raise its prestige. So the idea is teaching K through 12, it's a woman's work. It's not very prestigious, it's low paying, and if you're told exactly what you're going to teach when you go into the classroom and you're given a script, and you have to stick to it, then that's somehow more degrading than getting to go in and sort of decide how you're going to teach things and what you're going to teach, and to be creative and innovative and all of that. That is more interesting, it's more emotionally satisfying, it's somehow more prestigious because high prestige jobs have a lot of discretion. I think all of those ideas kind of feed into what teaching has become and what's taught to teachers as, their brief. And then finally, there's just plain old left-wing capture and progressivism, which is everywhere in the university and equally so in education schools. And then there's one more thing, which is kind of sensitive, which is that teachers have become less smart. It used to be that, women were shut out of all sorts of other professions. So, you had Mrs. Greenberg or whatever, with an IQ of 130 who was teaching you in 6th grade, who actually read books and knew something. Ideally, every teacher is like the tip of an iceberg, right? Submerged is this enormous well of knowledge. That's certainly the model for law professors. No, that is not. Well, theoretically. But that model has been lost for K through 12. Not so much in Europe, actually, where there are a lot of teaching in high school certainly is still very prestigious, and high school teachers are expected to be learned, like they're expected to be rabbis. The SAT scores of teachers are, with every decade, they have become lower and lower. And there are a lot of kids who are smarter than their teachers. So you put it all together, and it's not a good combination. Oh, and then you said, teaching thinking skills. Man, I am somewhat dubious of that. First of all, I think it's done really badly. All right, it's not taught as sort of really rigorous analytical skills, logic, how to falsify things, how to prove things, because that would get us into the territory of seeing that a lot of what's politically correct is actually false. Well, I'll be talking about that tomorrow. So that's very threatening. Now, if you really teach kids to be rigorous, they're going to start thinking for themselves in very unapproved ways. And secondly, I think the way you learn to think when you're young is by seeing how other people think. And that means reading. Reading a lot, reading deeply, reading the best, that's been thought and done. The exposure and the modeling of it is, I think, the best method. And then, of course, writing, but really having people correct your writing in a ruthless way, of course, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. I have law students, for the first time, I'm blue penciling their writing, and, they're shocked. How dare you correct my writing? Everybody has told me how wonderful I am. So that's the other problem.
Thank you, Amy. I totally agree with your assessment of the capture of the system. Earlier, I asked Scott and Terrence whether or not they believe that governments should get out of the business of funding universities. And Terrence suggested perhaps that they ought to be out of the business of funding education altogether. So, in theory or in principle, I know this is not sort of on the table politically right now, but in theory, what do you think about the proposition that governments should not be in the business of funding education at any level, from kindergarten all the way to the end, on the basis that if there is no system, the system cannot be captured. And if you have children, then you house the children, you feed the children, and you educate the children in the way that you think best. What do you think?
Well, it's very interesting because I have students. I helped run a reading and discussion group for the Federalist Society, and some of the students in the group firmly believed that there should not be government schools at all. I mean, they were very libertarian. I think, it is on some level an abomination that there are government schools. I mean, really, what is the government doing teaching our children? And inevitably all this normative stuff is going to come in there, and parents are going to disagree with it. I mean, this was another thing that came out in this fascinating oral argument in this Mammoth case. Very interesting. I would commend people to read it because it really covered a lot of ground. To me, the problem there is one of funding and financing. So, would we have vouchers? Because frankly, there are some parents that really can't afford schools. There's tremendous cross-subsidization in our education system. I mean, rich people subsidize poor people. And it's thought to be a public good. Right? It's thought to have incredible positive externalities. So
No, I understand that's the rationale.
I don't know how to solve
What do
that
you think?
problem.
But do you accept that rationale for the imposition, even if it's a system of vouchers or some other kind of cross-subsidization?
Well, I'm ambivalent because I think, in some ways our education system is worse than no education.
Right.
If there were some simple way to teach math and reading, it'd probably be just as good as what, 85% of our kids learn.
Right.
So I don't know. I would like to figure out a way to maintain that cross-subsidization, which I don't really object to as such, although I'm not big on redistribution in general, without the government control and intrusion, which is what we have now.
Thanks.
Thanks, I'm Amy. I'm a practicing lawyer, but I also homeschool my kids, so education is very important to me. And I've been saying for a very long time that kids person, and what you say sounds very good, but getting from there to there is the problem, right? We all recognize the problem. Here in Ontario, we have a, first of all, conservative government. You'd never know it, because it had 7 years of mixed education, and they've been afraid to touch it, because the Ministry of Education is captured, the teaching colleges are captured. Many of the younger teachers behave like they're in a cult, cross-examine some, and it's frightening. The older ones, Gen X and above, can't wait to get the hell out because they have to shut up all the time over what they actually think, and are probably on home leave, like getting paid because they've done something wrong by, having an independent thought. So we're in such a mess that the idea of coming in and kind of fixing things just, I'm sorry, it's a little bit pie in the sky. We aren't going to be able to do that. Now, then of course Bruce comes in with a solution, because that's what Bruce does. Let's just burn it all down. So my question is, what's going to be? What do you think about homeschooling? But to tag on to Bruce's comment, there is a bit of a redistribution that can happen in that context too, because families share the burden. They come together, and parents who are doing one thing will offer something. And there is a natural kind of community that develops when you take away the system, and it can benefit everybody. So we haven't talked about homeschooling. I just wondered if you had any thoughts of that as a possible solution.
Well, I love homeschooling. Some of my very best, most interesting students have been homeschooled. Okay, so I am a complete fan of homeschooling. And, as my husband often tells me, they can learn as much in about 2 hours a day as they will learn all day going to school. So there's so much time wasted in school. But here's the problem with homeschooling. I think as with so much else that people talk about in these settings, and I'm not really faulting them, I think it's just difficult to avoid, it's an elite project in the sense that you need to be sufficiently educated to do it. You need to be in a position where one parent can, devote some time to it. You have to have the kind of job where you're flexible. It's really not, if you read the brilliant book by Charles Murray, Coming Apart, which I recommend to everybody, you see that more and more in current society, the social classes are completely separate lives. I think, well-educated, professional, white-collar types, they barely ever encounter working-class people except in, the most transient kind of way. They don't really associate with and socialize with those people. They don't live with them. And it's very difficult for a truck driver married to, a clerk, or a telephone, what do you call people, telemarketer. These people have to come to work at a certain time. They can't take time off. They can't even go to the bathroom. I mean, how are they going to homeschool? All right, it's just not a feasible project for a vast number of people. So I just don't think it's a niche solution. It's not an overall systematic solution. I just don't think so.
I'll just quickly say that actually our experience was, it was very economically diverse in our homeschooling community. So you did have the truck drivers and the lawyers' kids integrating and helping one another. So it can be done.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe, it could be done a lot more than it is, but my exposure to homeschooling has been that it is confined to certain, largely, mostly, except in the religious community, to a certain social class. But, maybe it could be broadened. That would be great.
Thank you again for your talk. I'm a fan of Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, for the simple reason that he describes how people have become less and less engaged with their communities and participating in everything from bowling leagues to where you join fraternal orders, wear funny hats, or running for their school board.
Yeah, well, I mean, the bowling alone problem has so many causes. There are so many conditions that have contributed to it. Where do we start? Feminism and women going to work, okay, which has, put a lot of couples in a time crunch and parents in a time crunch. That's a big factor. The fact that people have to work really, really hard to afford houses in quote-unquote nice neighborhoods, and I have a theory about why that's gotten much worse. There are a lot of causes, but the biggest cause, to my mind, is the refusal to enforce public order and the criminal laws. So, there's tons of neighborhoods. They're just not places where people want to live. Nobody wants to talk about that. All right, so that puts people in a time crunch. They have to work very, very hard. The internet, recent article in the Atlantic Monthly, which is, a hideous publication, but occasionally, like every clock, it's right, broken clock, a couple of times, about how now every place is the same because you can conduct your whole life on your phone and your computer. And everything you need to do is right there in front of you. So why get out and participate? I mean, and the refusal to teach the fundamentals of citizenship and participatory democracy, except in a radical, progressive, activist way, right, to effect change of our nefarious, hideous, evil society. So, I can just keep going. All of that is working against participation and friendship and interaction and bowling leagues and the Rotary Club.
I agree, but I mean, those people living in nice neighborhoods do spend time at home watching Netflix as opposed to doing something else with their time, or they're watching sports or whatever else. It's just not inculcated, hasn't been since the baby booms, that we should spend 2 or 3 nights of your week outside, actually in a social organization of some kind.
Yeah.
And that seems to, Robert Putnam made a very good argument earlier when we did before Bowling Alone, that part of the reason Northern Italy had such a vibrant democratic culture was because people were joining choral societies. So they were getting out and getting to know each other, and of course they start talking, and one thing leads to another. It starts to drive political change, and we aren't doing that. And I guess for me the key question is, well, what can we do to change that, but also to teach our kids to do the same.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are pockets where these things do still occur. But, as Jean-Paul Sartre so cogently pointed out, hell is other people. It's just a lot easier to sit at home and stare at a screen than to deal with real-life people. It's interesting because there is a demographic in our society that has oodles of time and could be doing this stuff. And that is, pretty well-off retirees. I mean, they just have plenty of time and resources to be doing this. They don't seem to think that, this is a good use of their time. And part of that is they have fewer grandchildren. There's a lot of selfishness. There's much less sense of kind of Burkean obligation to the generations coming up behind us. I see this in my fellow professors. They could give a damn. People ask me, why are you fighting this fight with your institution? Why do you stay at a place that hates you? And I said, for the students, because, I want to leave them a kind of institution that is the way I think it should be. So I have to fight the culture wars for them. I'm not sure that attitude prevails anymore. So, yeah, you're right. People are watching a lot of movies. But that's the problem. They're watching a lot of movies.
If we go in the direction of a voucher system, or just get government out of K through 12, it seems to me that we would want a common core. But I'll throw that to you as a question. Do we want a common core? But then I see us getting right back to the original problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there is no way around, and well, you can do a Common Core, you know, in common, or you can do it in, you know, 100 different school districts and come to pretty much the same conclusions about what you want to be teaching and how you want to be teaching it. I mean, that's the way it used to be when I was growing up. That, you know, public schools taught pretty much the same stuff from the same textbooks. They had the same ideas about what they should spend time on and what they shouldn't spend time on. There was a lot of commonality. There wasn't a lot of diversity, but everybody came to it sort of from the bottom up. But once again, there is no substitute for politics. There is a culture war. I'm sorry to report. You know, my institution faulted me for telling my students, there's a culture war, there's a reason why they call it a war, because people get hurt. Right? In a war, people get hurt. And this is being fought tooth and nail. So what do you do when there's a culture war? You try to win by convincing people, persuading people, showing them why they're wrong. It's very hard work. Very, very hard work. Right? And it's bruising, and it's difficult and time-consuming. I don't see any substitute for doing that. Now, if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I guess just thinking about this, just on the fly, were there not a Common Core, if we just let schools have their own curriculum, could we not have a rating system, just publicize each school's success in placing students in top universities and colleges?
Well, who's going to rate them? And the other problem, and I haven't even talked about this, okay, which is all these progressive, political, you know, fanciful projects, like teaching gender fluidity and teaching whole language and, you know, teaching lefty history or whatever it is. Right? There's no assessment. There's no bottom line. Education schools and sociologists say they're studying, you know, outcomes and they're studying education and programs, but there's no real rigorous outcome assessment, in part because nobody can agree on what endpoints they ought to be measuring, because testing is so under a cloud. Testing differentiates people as, you know, smartest, smart, and less smart. In the United States, you know, we have our race preoccupation. Testing causes disparities, produces disparities, all right? And there is no way around that. People have been trying forever to get around that, reduce it. They've tried everything in the book.
That's a fight we can't let go, though, right? That's one of those political battles where if you give up on testing, you've conceded too much ground.
Well, right, I am totally opposed to giving up on testing. Totally opposed. I mean, but then you have to convince people that not all men are equal. And that's tough. Because a lot of people, I mean, we were talking at dinner, the American Association of Medical Colleges, my husband's a professor of medicine at Penn, actually states somewhere in its statements or charter, everyone has the same latent ability. We believe that everyone has the same latent ability. Now, excuse my language, what the hell does that mean?
I'm going to put a plug in for Lionel Schwab.
These are professionals.
Most recent book, Mania, where she
I read it.
Yeah, mental parity. I'm all behind MP.
So I have a thought that I've been working with about how we solve this problem. And I'm curious about what you think about this. But maybe our discussion has to be toward parents, about parenting. and that education is about parenting. And we have to start with saying our children are not special. Our children are not these unique things that we have to bubble wrap. We have to open up the door at 5 and say, go forth and deal with the bullies in the neighborhood. We have to let them out of our sight. We have to stop scheduling all their activities until they actually, if they show a real interest in talents and activities. We have to stop telling them how wonderful they are, or telling them that they are doing a good job when they're just brushing their teeth.
Good job.
Telling them that they're special in some way when they're not, or assuming or telling them how smart they are when they're only half-baked because they're 8. And I think that that's part of it. Like parents want schools, even if they don't want the left-wing, bullshit and the gender stuff, they still want, their kids to be treated like they want a child-centered, caring school environment where their kids' every emotional need is going to be taken care of, and all their family abilities are going to be looked at as disabilities that can be accommodated, and then they're going to jump through fields. And I think that if we speak to parents realistically about, who humans are, and that your child is not this, and your child is never going to succeed unless they become independent, and unless you let them go. I think that that might be the first stop that then parents will say to the teacher, stop telling my kid they got a good job, stop putting a star on their thing. When are you going to teach them, to read? I don't know, what do you think? Could that work?
First of all, I am 100% in agreement that parenting is totally broken. Okay? And what stuns me and fascinates me is the speed with which that has happened. I mean, when I compare the way I was raised, my parents were, sort of old school, very strict Jewish parents, frankly, to the way I see, I'm sorry to say, my grandson's being raised. But if I were to ever hear on a train or plane or in a public space, a parent say to a kid, sit down and be quiet, you are disturbing every person in this train, I would fall to my knees and say, glory, hallelujah, thank you. Because I have never heard that. Okay, when my son was suspended in 6th grade because he, threatened to burn down a school, suspended for a week. That's exactly what he said. I went to the principal's office and said, thank you, because this is a teachable moment. And she said, wow, that's not the usual reaction. And I said to my son, you have so many virtues, you're special, but you also have some challenges in your personality. You're impulsive, you have low frustration tolerance, blah, blah. You need to get a grip. It is your job to master your persona. No one else can do it. And you must show restraint, right? And I don't know. I mean, I don't know what parents are saying to their children, but I don't think they're saying stuff like that.
I would agree with you, and I just one other little piece of advice, and just from my own research, that how this left-wing, progressive, I call it criticalist, schooling really manifests itself as in projects. Your kids are going to get a million projects, they bring them home, you're expected to do the projects with them. They're mostly coloring projects, or lifting something off Wikipedia and then adding pictures and music and then turning it in. His parents should refuse to work with their children on their homework. And then the teachers are going to be in a dilemma because that's the expectation, that the parents are going to do the homework for the children. It doesn't really matter anyway because that kind of learning doesn't result in anything sticking in your long-term memory. Whatever they do will be forgotten within a matter of weeks. That sends a message. I mean, there are little ways, I think, there are little ways that I think the parents can rebel against that kind of stuff.
But I think parents, I feel sorry for them because they have lost that model. They're kind of set adrift on, the flotsam and jetsam of the zeitgeist. And they are given the message that, they can't be strict, they can't be mean, they can't convey that life is hard, life is suffering, Jordan Peterson, and all of that. That's not what you hear, that's not what you say. And there are some religious parents who do convey that message, but they're in the minority. Yeah, so we could go on all day about how parents are, really, I think, have adopted the wrong model. And they've done it out of love, but what it produces is, some really unfortunate outcomes. And they're not helping their children, because a lot of their children are miserable.
Thanks.
You gave a couple of practical reasons why not to discuss topics in moral or sociology or the hot button issues of today. I think one of them was that there's not a lot of time in school. There are other things to talk about. Another argument was that the teachers aren't very good at it. They're not going to help. And I find those are good arguments. One other argument you gave, I think, was that it can create ill will among the students and create tensions, and that this can then the tensions aren't going to go away in math class. The students will still be angry at each other. I'm not sure that that's a particularly strong argument. I think one reason why, if it was done well and didn't take up too much time, why discussing important moral and political and social problems in classes, it helps the children to be able to talk about these things without rancor and without feeling that the people with whom they disagree are evil or mean or whatever. I think my own high school, I hated school. But we did have in the world religions class and the sociology class and the history class, we did have discussions on these matters, and it was enlivening and useful, and I think it did help. And I'm talking grades 10, 11, 12, so high school, and I think these were beneficial. Now, I don't mind if it happens at earlier stages, if the children want to talk about homosexuality or capital punishment or whatever, then teachers are there to facilitate it. So I'm not too sure that, again, that the teachers aren't going to be very good at it and that it takes up some time. I think these are important arguments, but I wouldn't mind seeing discussions of serious topics, serious moral, political, social topics in elementary schools and high schools.
Well, I mind, because a couple of reasons. I recognize and I concede that it does enliven things and it does, make things more fun. And I think that's why a lot of teachers like it, because it's more fun for them, more fun for the students, etc. But I think it's a bad idea in general for a couple of reasons. First of all, the number of teachers who can really handle that in a neutral, disciplined way is few or none, right? It really requires a lot of intelligence and skill to navigate such a discussion among children or even adolescents, and to be neutral, which I think is the only way that is, the fair and right way to do it. A lot of teachers, I see this at the law school level, they literally have never been exposed to a so-called conservative point of view on X, Y, or Z. They don't understand the conservative mindset, the idea of, you know, deference to tradition, of Chesterton's fence, of, you know, why we would defer to the accumulated wisdom of mankind. They don't understand these ideas. They've never heard them. As far as they're concerned, there is no case for the conservative point of view. So they are incapable of navigating and, you know, directing such a discussion. The second is, you know, capital punishment, that is a complicated topic with many pros and cons. That's a topic that sophisticated lawyers grapple with. You can't just throw that out there as, you know, what do you think of capital punishment to a bunch of fifth graders who know nothing about anything and expect to get a fruitful experience out of it. I just think they're too ignorant, their knowledge is too shallow, they're too immature to really benefit from the debate. Right? Now I can imagine, you know, giving them a very stylized, prescribed set of readings on two sides of a fairly well-defined issue, and might have a fruitful experience, but that would be exceptional.
What about an after?
And homosexuality, I don't think should be discussed in public schools. I understand that gay people, you know, want complete and full equivalence and acceptance. I understand that, and in the law we have that, and I fully respect that. But I'm sorry, there are a lot of people who do not see homosexuality as equivalent in its desirability in every single way to heterosexuality. That is the reality.
Well, that could be a topic, right?
But it's not a topic for 10-year-olds.
Well, no. 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. What about an after-school club? We had the 318 clubs. There's a few teachers who were in charge of it. I think grade 11s and 12s sat around and talked about these things. Extracurricular. Would that be a matter of concern?
Well, my high school principal, whose name was Guy Anfanto, who really I would nickname 19th century man, if you had said to him, can we have an after-school LGBTQ club, you know what he'd say? No.
All right, Amy, I kind of want to try to get your opinion on something, maybe push you a little bit here. So, when I think about something like sex ed, you say that there should be none at all. So, here's what I think an educrat might say in response to that.
Sure.
You probably know what they would say.
Yes.
Is that some parents are not going to deal with this at all.
Right.
And I've listened to several of your podcasts. I think I may have heard that maybe you learned about sex from your friend Bonnie.
Bonnie Szymanski, when I was 14 years old.
So is there any concern then that rather than learning from a skilled educator who maybe has been trained in the art of this sensitive topic, that you are now just leaving children to peer education?
The tender mercies of their parents. I'm sorry, but, you know, we cannot make up for every dereliction that parents, however, you know, minor, the velleities and the venial sins of the parents, because actually it is a topic of great disagreement when these knowledge should be introduced, how it should be introduced, what children need to know, when they need to know it. I mean, that is an area where there's huge diversity of opinion, and it's very personal. So I just don't think the school should be, you know, stepping into that. and taking a position. Here's the irony in this case I told you about, the opt-out for little children. The Montgomery County lawyer admitted that for high school, sexuality and family instruction, their kind of sexuality health class, they have an opt-out. They allow teenagers to opt out of this class, but they don't allow 5-year-olds to opt out of Pride Puppy. It's kind of weird. The justices were amused. Or not amused. I just say, go back in time. There was a time where schools wouldn't dream of teaching this stuff. It just didn't happen.
Okay, there's no one behind me at the mic, so let me try to push it. Do you have any empirical evidence to support that there's any benefits of not teaching sex?
Do they have any empirical evidence that there's any benefit?
Well, let's stick to, are there any trends at all? Can you see, for example, changes in teen pregnancy over time, these sorts of things that might be correlated with...
Well, who has the burden of proof here? I mean, the fact is that, teen pregnancies have declined for a lot of different reasons, but out-of-wedlock births have skyrocketed. They've just shifted to later ages. All right, so now we have almost a 50% out-of-wedlock birth rate in our country. In combination, obviously it varies wildly by race and by class, says yes. But it's mostly women in their 20s and 30s because people are not getting married. And our teen pregnancy rate has declined. Now, I could just as well say, well, look at this out-of-wedlock birth rate. Now that we have sex ed, I identify a direct line from all of this sex ed to the fact that we've got this horrible out-of-wedlock birth rate. Someone else would say, well, we don't have a high teen out-of-wedlock birth rate, so it's a good thing. I would say, no, it's a bad thing. I mean, it depends on, what you use as the measure of the effect, and how do you trace the causation?
I'll join others in thanking you for your talk. I'm Andrew Robinson. I'm from Laurier. I believe you mentioned at the beginning of the talk a little bit about maybe talking about higher ed.
Right.
So if we take right now for the moment the K-12 system isn't going to change overnight. Many of us in this room are in higher ed. Do you have any thoughts about what we can do, where we're positioned, in order to try to contribute to moving things in a better direction?
Yeah, higher ed's a really tough problem because of, certainly in the American system, the First Amendment limits how prescriptive the government can be, both for public and private institutions. They probably have more discretion for public institutions because they fund them. Of course, we fund private institutions too. And under Title VI, we have some leverage over that. But the idea of telling universities, well, you can't teach this, you have to teach that, that can be very problematic. Probably can get away with a little bit in terms of positive mandates if you're funding the schools. But shutting people up is very difficult. So we have self-governing institutions that have figured out both how to capture the universities, which are in the United States almost entirely captured by the left wing, and they are self-perpetuating. So it's very hard to sort of break into them and break the monopoly. A couple of things that have been done, and you can't get conservatives hired. It's impossible for them to get tenure. The pipeline is dry because conservative kids very few of them get PhDs, and the ones who do don't want to go in academia because it's a toxic environment. That's what I've been told by a number. One thing that has been done and shows some promise is to develop these parallel institutions, even sometimes within existing universities. So a number of state legislatures have passed laws and allocated money to start these centers within existing state universities. So there's now the Clark Center at Ohio State, there's the Hamilton Center at University of Florida, there's now one being set up at the University of Tennessee. There's a bunch of others, one at Arizona. These tend to be red states where this is happening. And their charters vary. The challenge is to get them to be independent of the existing governing structure, which is completely captured and which, is dedicated to obstructing all of this. And there's been variable success. Once again, it's a problem for 50 states. That I think is a possibility. That does not help us with private universities like Harvard. The only leverage that you have over these very fancy, very rich private universities is federal funding, which is massive. All right, we're talking billions. It's mostly coming through biological sciences, the medical centers, the sciences, the hard sciences, but also through economics, through other programs. And under Title VI, any school that discriminates on the basis of race should lose their funding. And I don't think that Trump has gone nearly as far in using that lever and that stick. I really think, frankly, I think he's kind of gone off on a distracting direction with anti-Semitism. Well, that's a whole nother topic. But race discrimination happens in these universities every day in every way. You take my word for it. And this could be a way to defund the private universities. Of course, they are defending themselves to the hilt. They don't give an inch, right? And they've got this cadre of judges, these go-to judges, who will give them an injunction at the drop of a hat for everything they ask for. Right? So the obstacles are huge. I don't have any magical solution for higher ed in the United States of America. But at least Trump is trying. He's, in his bumbling way, he's really trying to do something about it. Well, thank you, and see you tomorrow.
Sorry, one more question here. Christina Fernandez, mother, living woman, parent. I'm wondering, have you had any success, or do you see any success, the possibility of any success in actually passing the sex ed curriculum entirely? Or do you think that in order to make some change, kind of along the lines of Jeff was saying, do we need to start just with the really radical stuff? And then with, like, for instance, my 11-year-old brought a book home from the year 2000, so it's pretty tame compared to the new stuff that's out now. And it literally said, you cannot talk to your parents about sex. Like, it said, forget about it. When it comes to sex, you cannot talk to your parents about it. So you need to find a trusted adult to talk about it. So this is tame compared to what we see now. So
Yeah, but it's awful.
It's terrible.
Talk to your parents.
It's terrible. But do we just shed light? Do we shed light on those extreme, like, just preposterous things? Or do you think, no, it's better off to, state the case that sex ed is just, it shouldn't be here? Like, where do you think we should be spending our time, realistically?
I do not think it should be here. I think the goal should be to get rid of it entirely because, number one, it's been done, it works. It worked for decades and decades, and the change, I think, was completely unnecessary, completely, not needed. Number two, once again, as I said, there is no neutral way to teach this stuff. It's always going to incorporate a particular point of view, and it's going to be the point of view of a bunch of teachers who went to ed school. And that is just unacceptable. I would rather banish sex ed entirely than risk that kind of contamination and indoctrination. And once again, I see that nothing is lost. Absolutely nothing is lost. The school should teach, reading, writing, arithmetic, basic science, history. Oh my gosh. I mean, history and civics, which are totally neglected. I have students coming to Penn Law. We're talking about, students who scored at the top 1% of the LSAT. This is an elite school, an elite group of kids who have no idea what's in the Constitution. Literally, they've never read it. They have no idea how our government functions, can't name the 3 branches of government, don't know what federalism is, probably couldn't spot you the century of the First World War, couldn't tell you who was on the opposing sides. Know nothing. They literally know nothing. I mean, they know all about Rosa Parks. They know all about Martin Luther King. Maybe they know 1 or 2 things about Lincoln. Just the degree of ignorance is stunning.
Right, you made a really great point about just the fact that a heterosexual relationship, children being brought up and fostered by the 2 people that created them, is absolutely the gold standard. It's what even those who weren't brought up that way would wish for somebody else. That it doesn't happen all the time. It's not to say that when it doesn't happen, that we don't love them just the same and we don't care for them.
Well, nobody's saying any of that.
Right, but people don't understand the facts and the stats that come with that. So do you think something like, are you familiar with Wonderfully Made? The sex ed curriculum, Wonderfully Made. Are you familiar with that at all?
No.
Okay, so I'm wondering if I don't know that not teaching it would be, I wonder if just teaching truth would be the best way to go. And so yeah, anyway, I'm curious to know more about what you would think of something like Wonderfully Made. Maybe we can chat a little bit afterwards at some point.
Well, I think there's a difference between teaching something and just assuming and accepting something in, what used to be quite common, a kind of grudgingly tolerant way, like this is. And, we're not denying that it is, we just don't talk about it. There's a lot of virtue in not talking about things that has been lost. And that just doesn't seem to be on the radar screen. Once again, and everybody says, well, someone's going to talk about their husband and what they did this weekend. Well, actually not. My teachers never talked about that stuff. They didn't come into class and say, oh, we went down to the shore this weekend, and this is what we did.